August 1920. For the letter contained notification that a hotel room, the Astoria, had been booked for the newly married couple. As it was just Mrs. Crawley and her son who knew Milo Ashby and Thomas Barrow were going to marry, the gift was really from them. "We will leave you both to it," Matthew Crawley told them. "We will remove to Downton before you get back. I can smooth out any difficulties, should there be any." "Goodbye," said Mrs. Crawley, beaming a smile to Milo and handing her a bag. "Your usual clothes are inside, and some personal items. I thought you would like to walk to your dinner in your dress." "Yes," she assured her. "It is yours." "Mrs. the Lord Grantham has made that clear." Milo nodded, hoping that she might be able to change before the dinner, and she wondered how on earth she would get out of the dress. Mrs. Crawley had had difficulty getting Milo into it, for it was meant for a corset and she had none. Isabel Crawley had made it fit as best she could. Mrs. Crawley waved as Thomas escorted Milo by the arm to the Astoria Hotel, and spoke to the maitre d' about the arrangement that had been made for them. Milo was grateful. She did feel hungry, though she couldn't remember eating out at a restaurant before, and was instantly nervous about something new. "Please change, should you wish to," Thomas said, as he withdrew his cigarette from behind his ear when they had reached the room. "Sweet, no less," Thomas noticed. Milo looked in the bag she had been given by Isabel Crawley. It did indeed contain her clothes, so she turned to Thomas and said, "What would you prefer me to wear, Thomas?" He glanced at the suit of Ernest's that Milo had asked him to alter for her. "Whatever you like," he told her. When she still looked confused, Thomas added, "What would you feel comfortable in?" They were down several minutes after that, as Thomas undid his wife's wedding dress, and crossed to the window to look at the carriages in Prince's Street as she undressed to her slip. Many automobiles, Thomas thought. More than when he and Ernest had. "Here?" Milo called to Thomas, and he looked at his wife. Milo looked like herself, and in looking like herself, Milo looked less unsettled. Thomas crossed the floor to her, and held out a hand. Milo took it and he glanced down at the ring on her finger, her mother's. Ernest had told him once, when he had been at his father's house. When he had suggested it to Milo, she had said she needed to think about it, and, once she had told Thomas that it was a perfect idea. Milo was pleased Thomas knew how to order, and she followed his lead, wondering when it was she had eaten at a table other than the kitchen table at Downton. And after dinner, Thomas escorted her up the stairs back to their room. He stood by the window again, looking down at the street lamps, before drawing the curtains again. Milo, however, was not under the sheets and blanket. Instead, she was looking at the electric lights mounted on the wall. Thomas gave her a small smile, before taking off his coat and shirt, folding them over the back of the dressing table chair, then unclipping his braces from his trousers and slipping those off too. Down to vest and pants, Thomas folded back the covers and slipped into the freshly laundered sheets. Milo was still looking at the lamps. "Don't go tampering with them," Thomas said, sighing into the pillows he had propped up behind himself. Milo turned, and smiled. "If they had wired them with a ring rather than a series circuit," she began, then stopped, when she saw her husband smiled at her. Even though they had settled for one another, for reasons other than attraction, Milo felt the weight of their commitment race through her mind. Would it make you too upset if we spoke about Ernest?" Milo ventured. She sat on the edge of the bed and turned to look at Thomas. "If you like," he said, and smiled. "What would you like to talk about?" "When did you meet him?" she asked. "Was I born then? Was I young?" Thomas smiled again. Thomas lay back and looked to the ceiling, and then across to the window. "Your father came to Downton. He had just come back from Ireland, back from your grandmother. Your mother had died, and he had taken you and Ernest back there. Ernest had his degree, and your cousin, Guglielmo, was helping your brother take up his postgraduate work." He shook his head, and looked at her. "You were very small, you were 4 or 5. "And you spoke to her?" Milo asked her. "You got talking?" "We got talking," Thomas told her. He told me of his work in physics at Cambridge. Rutherford had just been awarded his Nobel Prize and it was in the newspapers. Lord Grantham knew about him, and when your father told his lordship that Ernest was a student of Rutherford's, it impressed him enough to discuss electricity. He looked across to Milo. Despite the Dowager fretting about noxious gases and worrying that the house would burn down in the night. And I was there when he was talking, Thomas continued, and I watched him speak with such eloquence, such passion, explaining to his lordship exactly how the electrical lighting could be installed with minimal disruption by fitting it where the gas lights had been. A little more expensive, but not a good deal. He showed a demonstration, and the Dowager closed her mouth and marveled at their brilliance, shone as they were through a beautiful crystal shade. He turned his head back to the window, and I thought, that man has just shut up the Dowager. He must be a magician. Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper, and Milo could see even in these inferior lights that her husband's eyes had filled with tears. To me he was. It took Milo only a few seconds to stand up and take off her suit, shaking out her hair and standing beside the bed in her slip. Thomas offered no resistance when she climbed between the sheets herself. She folded the covers between them a little, then, reaching for his arm, ran her hand down to his. Thomas did not resist, and instead put his hand to his face, wiping his tears onto the back of his hand. Thomas, Milo asked, when she sensed his tears had finished, we did the right thing today. It wasn't a question, and it was unlike her to be so assertive. I think we did. In the darkness, Thomas turned his head, and leaned across to Milo, placing a delicate kiss on her forehead. I think so too, he replied. It must have been a matter of minutes afterwards that Milo had closed her eyes and gone to sleep, for the next thing she knew she had been awoken by the brilliant sun glancing through the window. Thomas was dressed and inspecting the street again. We need to go, Milo, if we are to be back today, he told her, and she pulled herself out of the covers and put her feet onto the carpet. Here, Thomas said, handing Milo her shirt and then her trousers as she stood baldly in front of him, her slip bright white in the late summer sun. We can breakfast on the train, he told her, and smiled a little as he watched her fumble her shirt into her trousers, hindering her speed in the process. Stand there, Thomas told her, and she stood there, arms out and, like Lord Grantham's valet, straightened her out, holding open her jacket so she could put her arms in. Milo touched her trouser pocket and felt something there. She pulled it out. Keep it safe, Thomas told her, as he strode to the door, and held it open for her. There is a reason that the wife has it. It is to show her change of name. Milo stopped, and looked at Thomas, like a startled rabbit. I'm your wife, she half whispered, as if the thought had only just occurred to her. Thomas, there are some things we need to discuss. I'll come to your house this evening, Thomas told her. I am not due back on duty until tomorrow. So when the train got in at Downton, Mr. and Mrs. Barrow nodded to one another and then set off in opposite directions, Milo back to the house that was once her father's and that was now hers. She opened the shop, and looked at her papers, her mind swirling with all kinds of thoughts. A pot of tea later, and Milo had written 2 letters. One to her grandmother telling her that she was married, and the name of her husband and where he worked. He is a good, honest man, Milo assured Mrs. Jameson, before sealing the envelope and attaching King George's head in philatelic form. The second she took a little more care with. It was to James Chadwick. She thanked him for his attendance and asked what was to happen next, and when. For she was married now, and should be able to now move to Manchester and do her work in the Cavendish laboratory beside him. Things would move faster, especially with Chadwick's work with an unknown particle registering persistent mass inconsistencies. And Thomas returned to Downton Abbey. It was Carson who noticed his under-butler striding over the fields in the direction of the yard. Noticed was in fact a misleading verb, for the man had been watching out for him. I want to keep it a low-key until I can speak to his lordship, he told Mrs. Hughes, as the Ford passed Thomas as it went down the long drive. Lady Edith had offered to drive. Milo was mistaken if she thought she was going to have an evening to get on top of her work, for the car was for her. "Do you think she will come?" Edith asked her sister. Lady Mary looked out at Thomas's retreating figure and then to the end of the driveway that led to the road. "She doesn't have to. It's not as if Papa is in charge of her." "If they have married, as Matthew says," Mary said, "and she really is Mrs. Barrow, then, in effect, she does." 88,888,888. "So you are saying, Mr. Carson, that your concern is for where Milo chooses to spend her nights?" Far from getting a restful evening, Thomas had been accosted as he opened the kitchen door by the human alarm that was Daisy alerting Mrs. Batemore and Mrs. Hughes of his arrival. "Mr. Carson wants a word," Mrs. Hughes told him, her face as dark as thunder, and she bustled him into Carson's office. "Why?" he asked. "Because you have just made life pretty complicated for yourself, as well as me, Lucina." Perhaps he was arrogant to think he could just slip into the house and act as if his marriage to young Milo was just an amusement, like a visit to the seaside or to the music hall. "Mr. Barrow will have to explain to his lordship," Carson told Mrs. Hughes. "But I need to know, now, where it is that your wife will be spending her time when she is asleep." "I do not think that is any concern of," he broke off when Carson banged his hand on his desk. "You do not think?" he roared. "Do you not think that there is a reason all spouses are vetted by someone before a servant marries? It is for the reputation of the house." Carson shook his head. "That you chose to marry that vulnerable girl is your own affair, as it is hers. But, I must know, does she have somewhere suitable to stay?" "Not in my room." Thomas knew that he was being flippant, rude, but he just wanted to see Carson's face. "Heavens, no!" Carson roared back. But he stopped, as he guessed Thomas was probably trying to provoke him. "So, you got married today, Mr. Barrow," Thomas replied, mock-imitating a version of events and in doing so letting Carson know this was the tone of conversation he was expecting. "Congratulations. We all hope that you are both going to be very happy. Let us discuss your living arrangements. Tell us, please, what it is you have discussed, for I know you won't have made any unconsidered decisions." Thomas did not smile at his insouciance, for it was enough that Carson had fallen into such a rage he could find no words. But Mrs. Hughes could, and she turned to Thomas Barrow. "Up, now, to his lordship. Interrupt him if you must, but tell him, and reassure him you have not brought this house into disrepute." Disrepute, Thomas thought, as he climbed the stairs, Mrs. Hughes and Carson behind them. As they got to the hall, a door opened. Thomas turned at the sound and saw Milo, still in her suit, still in her opals, and flanked by Ladies Edith and Mary, climb the back stairs. She saw Thomas, and smiled. His heart sank. An ambush. Mrs. Hughes peeled away from Carson's side and followed them. And, with the word, disrepute being used, Thomas helped that someone did not think that he had done anything to Milo in any way. 88,888,888. The door opened to the withdrawing room, and Lord Grantham turned to see Thomas in the company of Carson. He got to his feet, and gave Thomas a long look, before turning to Carson. "You tell me Barrow, here, has something to tell me." Thomas inhaled, then noticed that Matthew Crawley was behind his lordship. That was something, at least. The door closed, but Milo, who was being escorted into the small drawing room, did not notice who had gone in. Mary and Edith were bringing Milo, with Mrs. Hughes following just behind them. "We thank you for bringing her," the Dowager told her granddaughters. "You are no longer needed." And Violet Crawley, with glacial patience, waited for the reluctant Mary and Edith to leave. "Not you, Mrs. Hughes," said the Dowager, and then glanced at Milo. "Miss Ashby," she began. "Mrs. Barrow," Isabel Crawley corrected. The Dowager looked over her shoulder to Matthew's mother and glared. "That is to be established." She glanced at her hands. In them, Milo was holding the box from which her opals had been lifted, as Thomas had fixed them round her neck. She had not taken them off yet. "But they are lovely." Cora Crawley, who had been sitting on one of the high-back chairs, got up and gave Milo a smile brighter than any bulb she had ever fitted at Downton. Milo reached to her neck. "They are made of a mixture of metal compounds," Milo explained, touching the delicate gemstones. Bragg has shown me the diffraction of the light, which is why the crystals seem to have different colors in them. Bragg. The Dowager looked between Cora and Isabel. Laurie Bragg, Milo told her. The X-ray crystallographer. He works with Chadwick and Rutherford, in the same building. At any rate, they are meant to be bad luck, aren't they? The Dowager told them. Milo frowned. Why? Because they break so easily, she told Milo, who smiled. Because the internal crystal structure is not so stable, different compounds are present, so the structure means clusters form. But Cora Crawley was crossing over to her. These are so fine, Mama, she told the Dowager, then looked back to the necklace. Are they from Australia? Although Nevada, in the US, also supplies opals. Not so fine as these, though. She glanced at the beautiful lined box in Milo's hands. Never mind all that, the Dowager told her daughter-in-law. It is the health and well-being of Miss Ashby we are concerned with. And I thank you for your concern, Milo told them, as shouts came through from the drawing room. I know I am different, and that is why you are concerned. I know full well what I have done, and I do feel a little ashamed. Why? Isabel Crawley asked. Milo looked to her. Because I knew it would get me to Manchester. I knew I would not have to wait around for a guardian. Is that what you wanted my baby's dress for, Mrs. Crawley? For Milo, Cora asked, smiling warmly to her. Only the one your mother picked out for her, Isabel Crawley told her. I considered it a gift, and so it was, Cora declared. Did you look beautiful? Milo looked at the three women's expectant faces. I don't know, Milo told them, stumbling over the concept. She had not seen herself, so how could she tell? Thomas told me so. She looked at Mrs. Crawley. You told me so. And so you did, she told her, though Milo did not smile, and she took off the necklace and placed it back into its box. I can keep it for you. I'll ask Mary to keep it safe, if you wish, her ladyship told Milo. Considering the letter, you are a lucky young woman to receive this. He must care about you very much. I care about him. But, Lady Grantham, we are friends who care for one another, and that is it. I am going to carry on living at my father's, my house, she told them. I am hoping that Mrs. Hughes will tell me that the bee. She stopped and broke off, knowing that she was about to call Carson, the bear once again, as she had done when she was young. You hope Carson will allow Barrow to remain in the servants' rooms? Milo nodded. We are married in name only. There will be nothing else. That seemed to satisfy everyone to some degree. She saw the look in Mrs. Crawley's eyes, and Mrs. Hughes, one of a concern Milo could not quite fathom. We wish to keep this silent, to keep everything the same as it was. But if someone asks you, more shouting. Lord Grantham again. Why can they not resolve it as we have just done? Lady Grantham asked to them all. We have established that Milo has not been taken advantage of by Barrow, and my son seems to think needs a tongue lashing as if he has just lost half of the 9th Legion. If someone asks me, Milo told them, I will tell them I am Mrs. Barrow. Milo said simply. We have discussed it, and agreed. Nor will Thomas deny it. But that is it. And no ring, Cora Crawley commented, sadly. Oh, I have a ring, my mother's. But I have put it away, in the box. She nodded to the necklace box in her ladyship's hand. I have taken it off because I would only lose it, or break it. It is so good you will keep it with my necklace. She glanced to the dress, which Mary had brought with her from Milo's house. This is yours too, Cora Crawley told her. It never really was Sybil's. It never really fitted her, and I cannot recall it properly whether she ever did wear it. More shouting, and the women looked to the wall which divided their drawing room with the one in which Lord Grantham was raising the roof. There is just one more thing, before you go, Isabel Crawley cautioned. She smiled as she looked at Milo's innocent face. Last night, you and Thomas spent your first night together as a married couple. Yes. Did he do anything unnatural to you? I mean. She glanced to Cora and to the Dowager, then back to Mrs. Hughes, all three women looking at Isabel encouragingly. I don't know what you mean. Mrs. Crawley sighed. But Mrs. Hughes took over. Mrs. Crawley says you know that Thomas is not one for the ladies. Yes. What was all of this? She wanted to be back at home. In fact, Thomas was meant to meet her there. A panic began to set in, and Milo felt her heart begin to race. Did he treat you? Did he hurt you? Milo shook her head, and looked at the four women who were clearly trying to extract some information from her. She wouldn't mind at all sharing it, either, but she had no idea what they were driving at. So, Thomas and I stayed at the hotel for which you gave us the booking, Mrs. Crawley, Milo told them. All eyes were on Isabel, who displayed a happy visage of innocence. We went and got changed. We ate dinner. We returned to the room. I looked at the electrical lighting while Thomas undressed for bed. He looked out of the window when I did. We talked about Ernest, and that made Thomas cry a little. I got into bed next to him and, the four women chorused. And we held hands for the longest time. And then we must have gone to sleep, because the next thing I remember was this morning and we were getting dressed to go. More shouting was coming through from the other room. You lied to us, Barrow, Lord Grantham accused. What do you have to say about it? Thomas looked back to Lord Grantham boldly, but nodded his head in acknowledgement. I told Carson I was going with Milo. I did not say where. Oh, indeed you did, Carson thundered, turning to Thomas angrily. I clearly heard you say Manchester. Perhaps I can help there, Matthew interjected, taking a step towards Carson and Thomas. I mentioned mother and I would be going to Manchester. This is where you may have heard of it, Carson. Maybe, Mr. Crawley, but, he turned to Barrow, you had no right to ask for 2 days. And Mrs. Hughes tells me that you and me Lucina spent the night at the Astoria. Lord Grantham looked at Thomas in astonishment, and with a trace of disgust, Thomas noticed. And then he realized what this was really all about. That was highly inappropriate. Lord Grantham thundered. It was, ultimately, about the reputation of Downton, and yes, their way of going about getting married was questionable. But here was the thing that was concerning them all most. Not in the least. She is now my wife and I have nothing to feel ashamed of, my lord. But your tastes are with men, Carson managed, although Thomas thought he was about to throw up. Please tell me, with Milo dressing in her brother's clothes, you did not forget she is a woman, Barrow, and not a man? Nothing of physical intimacy passed between Milo and myself last night, Thomas told them. Nor will it ever. And, with respect, that is the last thing I will say on the matter. How could they think it? And yet, he was different. So unnatural. Practices were disgusting. As if he could ever do that with a woman, Thomas told himself. Anything with a woman. Lord Grantham stared at Thomas for a moment, and then nodded, looking to the floor and then to his writing table. Right, he said. Then, he looked to Carson. Carson, could you bring the ladies, and Milo in, please? He crossed to his desk and picked up a letter. There is something she should hear. He looked to Thomas. Something you both should hear. Thomas. Milo saw him standing near the door as the women escorted her through to the main drawing room, and she made to rush to him. But a look on Lord Grantham's face quelled her passage. Instead, she stood by him, glancing upwards, shyly. Thomas looked down to her, and gave her a small, brief smile. How it is that Professor Rutherford knew of your marriage of only yesterday, and had the time to write to me, I will never know, Lord Grantham confided, looking over the sheet of paper. However, he writes to tell me that, due to the marriage of me Lucina Ashby to Thomas Barrow, he is pleased to be able to bring forward the date of commencement of her studentship at the Cavendish Building at the University of Manchester. He looked to Milo and smiled. Congratulations, me Lucina, he extolled, and all, except Carson, repeated Lord Grantham's words. May I ask when? Thomas's question came like a knife through butter, as Milo reached for his hand for just a second, as if checking he was still there. Lord Grantham looked across the missive once again. He says, he would be pleased to welcome you next Wednesday. The 28th August. Why, that's next week, exclaimed the Dowager. My dear, will you have enough time to be ready? Thomas reached for Milo's hand, and this time held on to it, before looking at her face, from which she could not yet make the smile leave. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. You will just have to be, won't you,